Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. You might think that since I mostly cover retro gaming stuff, that I'd never bother to do a video on the Switch 2, and if you think that,
well, you're wrong!
I wanted to wait until the Switch 2 furor died down a bit before chiming in myself. For this video, I'm going to go over a few things, the facts about what we know so far, and the opinions I have on things like its power level and price. I've rewritten this script many times, much more than I ever have for any video before, because before I finished it, new information just kept on coming out that contradicted old information, and I wanted to make sure this video was as accurate as possible. Now, what you won't find here today are the irrational or emotional responses which have been smothering the internet since the Switch 2 was revealed a little over a week ago. Now, I will tell you up front that I have been critical of Nintendo's modern business practices on things like the original Switch, but I have every system they've ever made, well, except the Virtual Boy, and loads of games for them. My last video was about how great the Game Boy Advance was. Alright, enough setup, let's get on with it. As we delve into this, I'm not going to use any direct footage from Nintendo, because I don't want to deal with any possible copyright or legal situations from them, which is a real concern these days. I've put some links in the description when appropriate, and anything in this video that I attribute to Nintendo executives will be something they actually said in interviews that you can see or read for yourself by checking those links in the description. So let's begin with a look at the system itself. The Switch 2 looks like a larger, more rounded Switch, and that's fine. I don't really have any issues with the design. I don't think Nintendo needed to reinvent the wheel with the overall look of the system, and it looks different enough from the original that people shouldn't mistake a Switch 2 for a Switch 1. No problems there. I also think there's no problem with the name Switch 2. Some people have likened it as an issue similar to the Wii U naming problem. Now, I disagree with that. I think the Wii U was a confusing name for some people because it was not an iterative name, so it sounded like a product related to the original Wii rather than a successor. People understand numbers after names. As to more important matters, we still don't know the exact hardware specifications of the Switch 2 yet, such as the particular system on a chip powering the device. Some websites and channels are making educated guesses and speculating on the system on a chip based on various Nintendo leaks and some other information that's out there. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'll tell you we won't know exactly what NVIDIA chip is in the system until either Nintendo tells us, which is unlikely, or people do a teardown and get a look at the internals of the device. Maybe the guesses out there are 100% on point and correct. Maybe they aren't. So let's talk about what we do know. Nintendo announced that the Switch 2 supports up to 4K resolution at 60 frames per second while the system is docked, and up to 1080p at 120 frames per second with a 120Hz refresh screen when the system is in portable mode. The system also supports HDR, variable refresh rates, and some degree of ray tracing. Sounds impressive, right? But to paraphrase the bard, what's in a frame? Switch 2 games will be capable of using NVIDIA's DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling. What is that? Well, in a nutshell, it uses AI to fill in the gaps when increasing an image or frame's resolution to a higher resolution, adding a level of detail that was not present in the original image. DLSS has had mixed results on PC gaming up to this point, with some details getting smeary or just looking weird or glitchy in games that make use of it. Newer versions of the tech tend to look better. How do Switch 2 games look when compared to existing systems? Well, if we compare games like Final Fantasy VII Remake on the Switch versus the same game on PS5, albeit through a patched PS4 version of the game, in still pictures, it might not look that different, but be reasonable, people. If you watch the videos of FF7 Remake on Switch 2 released up to this point, you can tell the Switch 2 version of the game is not performing at the same level. It's been confirmed that FF7 Remake runs at 1080p resolution on Switch 2 and targets 30 frames per second, which it sometimes fails to achieve. Now that's a fraction of the resolution and half the frame rate of the game running on a PS5 while the Switch 2 version is docked. Now, I didn't expect the game to be on par with the PS5 version. I don't think anybody should have. The only reason I'm bringing it up here is because this is what people are talking about right now and what they're saying on social media. So other hints about the power level of the Switch 2 can be found in information gleaned from the performance of some of the other announced games. Cyberpunk on the Switch 2 targets 40 frames per second in performance mode while docked, and 30 FPS in quality mode, and makes use of dynamic resolution. In portable mode, the dynamic resolution apparently drops as low as 540p. Yikes. Hogwarts Legacy will also run at about 30 to 40 frames per second while docked. The Switch 2 version of Elden Ring is set to run at 1080p at 30 frames per second with dips below that. EA's Split Fiction, just recently released on other systems, runs at 30 frames per second on Switch 2, while it runs at 60 frames per second on all the other modern consoles. including the Xbox Series S. Switch 2 editions of last-gen Switch games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, run at 1440p and 60 frames per second, failing to hit the 4K mark. So where exactly is this system power-wise in the pantheon of current gaming hardware? Based on the numbers I just mentioned, not intuition, not feelings, but the numbers we've seen so far, it seems from real games on the system, it is likely around the power level of a PlayStation 4, possibly a tiny notch higher, but definitely not as high as a PS4 Pro. Just keep in mind the Switch 2 does have some extra features that the PS4 doesn't have, like the aforementioned VRR, DLSS, and ray tracing. Although I have to wonder how much ray tracing we'll actually see in the system's games. Now, I've seen people in online forums likening the Switch 2 to a quote-unquote mid-tier PC, and that seems like an overly optimistic assessment. I mean, it seems much more like a modern entry-level gaming PC. For Cyberpunk alone, CD Projekt Red's recommended specs for the game to achieve 1080p at 60 frames per second on PC is basically an above-average CPU and at least an RTX 2060 Super, which is a mid-tier 6-year-old video card at this point. And I know that card very well because it was my main video card for about 4 years. So sure, the Switch 2 is also portable, and definitely a step up from the Switch, but let's not exaggerate its capabilities. That's bad for people's expectations. Regarding Switch 2 storage, Nintendo touted the fact that the Switch 2 has, quote, 8 times the storage of the Switch. And sure, that's technically true. The original Switch had 32GB of flash storage built in, but it's the year 2025 now, and the Switch 2 only has 256GB of storage. That is not at all sufficient for a device released in mid-2025. There are literally single games these days, often with additional downloads and expansions, that are larger than the entire Switch 2's internal storage. If you think I'm spouting nonsense, let's take a look at a few of them. We have Ark Survival Evolved. With some of its DLC, well, that's over 250GB. Call of Duty Cold War is right there with it at just a tinge under 250GB, but with expansions, that one can go as high as 350GB. There is no sane argument in 2025 and beyond that 256GB of internal storage is enough storage, and a more sane amount would have been 512GB. The Switch 2 does have an expansion slot, one that takes microSD express cards. What is a microSD express card, you ask? Well, they're microSD cards based on a newer standard that can achieve much higher transfer speeds than the prior generations of microSD cards. How fast are they? Roughly 3 times faster than the fastest regular microSDs, currently topping out at just under 1000 megabytes per second. So what do they cost? Well, right now, and these prices will likely decrease in time, you can get a 256GB microSD express card for about $60, a 512 card for about $90, and 1TB cards have actually just been unveiled a few days before I recorded this, and they're going to sell for $200 at the start. So in the early days, if you want extra storage for your Switch 2, it's gonna cost you. Now, I really like the original Switch for the most part. You may have seen that I've done occasional game reviews on this channel for it, and some other related stuff. But you know what I loathe about that system that has so many games that I absolutely love? The absolutely horrendous, god-awful, overpriced junk known as the Joy-Cons. Yeah, I know I said I'd keep emotion out of this, but allow me just this one little indulgence, since it's about the original Switch. Aside from being too small and shoddily manufactured and subject to analog stick drift, they were also incredibly uncomfortable to use. Then, when Nintendo found and acknowledged the issue, they were coy about solutions, and many people like me, who experienced stick drift years into their Switch ownership, we took matters into our own hands and just replaced the faulty internal parts ourselves. But surely, over the last few years, Nintendo has learned their lesson from the Joy-Con stick drift debacle, right? Don't count on it. Nintendo execs stated that they corrected the issues that resulted in wear and blah blah blah, and then later they said they didn't use Hall effect sensors, which are known to reduce problems with specific issues such as stick drift. Now, Hall effect sensors are not an absolute must, but most higher mid-tier to high-tier controllers these days have been incorporating them for years. And what's new control-wise? Well, you can use them as the world's least comfortable mouse now. Oh well, at least they're a little bigger. I'll reserve judgment on the Joy-Con 2s until I try them out and get to use them for a while, but Nintendo is not making a positive first impression. Also, for the original Switch, the Pro Controller may just be the lowest quality controller Nintendo ever made aside from the Joy-Cons. It easily has the worst D-pad on any Nintendo controller I've ever used, and I've used all of them. Mine also has a host of issues I've never had with any other controller, like grinding and creaking. Nintendo announced the Switch 2 Pro Controller during their system reveal, and I'm going to tell you this one would need to be vastly improved to get a purchase from me. I'm willing to give it a try, but I don't trust it based on the last gen Pro Controller. Nintendo claims to have improved the D-pad, and, prevent things like wear, but we'll see. I pretty much only use third-party gamepads on the Switch these days, because I had so many issues with Nintendo's first-party controllers. Now, if you were a fan of using the original Switch portably, one of the worst things about the original Switch in portable mode was battery life. If you were playing a more advanced game, you might get 3 to 3.5 hours out of it before you needed to plug it in. If you had one of the more recently manufactured models of the original Switch with the updated Tegra X1 chip in it, well, then you might have gotten up to 4.5 hours with heavier games. So what's the deal with Switch 2 then? Nintendo announced that battery life on the Switch 2 will be worse than the original. You can expect as little as 2 hours on a charge if you're playing heavier games such as Cyberpunk. Now, I'll come straight out and tell you that for the original Switch, I almost never play it portably, so for me, this really wouldn't be a huge deal. But I do know lots of people that take their Switch with them everywhere they go and play their games while they're out and about. If you're one of those people, you better make sure you have an AC adapter or car charger with you everywhere you go. Okay, there's a lot of both confusion and misinformation out there right now on physical Switch 2 games. Let's clear some of that up. First up, there are two kinds of physical games for the Switch 2, game cards and game keys. Let's address game cards first. These will be more normal cards, up to 64 gigabytes in size that contain an entire game. There's been some specific confusion about Switch 2 editions of Switch 1 games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. However, if you hadn't heard, Nintendo addressed this directly and said that these games contain the full original Switch game and the update for the Switch 2 on the game card. There was a rumor that these would be repackaged Switch games and you'd have to download the update, but that was apparently incorrect. And that brings us to other questions though, like why is the 8-year-old Breath of the Wild being repackaged and sold for $70 for the Switch 2? It didn't even cost that much when it was brand spanking new. Absolutely shameful and pretty much unprecedented in gaming. And if you're wondering if it includes the DLC, it doesn't. If you want that, that's another $20, so you'll be out $90 if you want the full Breath of the Wild experience on Switch 2. Now you could just upgrade your original Breath of the Wild if you have all that stuff already. That's going to cost you $10 if you don't have NSO. Now let's talk about the game key situation. What's a game key? Well, some, not all, Switch 2 games that you buy a physical version of will contain a cartridge in the case that doesn't actually have the game on it. Instead, you'll insert the cartridge into a Switch 2 system, and then the game downloads, and you must always have the game key inserted in the cartridge slot in order to play the game. One such early game for the system will be Bravely Default HD. So what is the point of this nonsense? Why not just download it? The idea here is the physical game keys will not be tied to any Nintendo account. So you can take that copy of Bravely Default HD and then put it in another Switch 2, have it download the game, and play it on that device as long as the game key is inserted. Remove the key, and the game cannot be played even if it's downloaded on your system. So this will let you lend games to other people and to resell them. So this sounds like it's all good then, right? Not exactly. On the very, very negative side, once the download portion of the game is removed from Nintendo's servers at some point in the future, the game key will be useless on devices where the game data is not already installed. So at some point in the future, and no one knows when, you might insert a game key into a different Switch 2 to find out that it's useless now because the online portion of the data is gone forever. That's an absolute disaster for game preservation. It's short-term thinking at its worst. Oh boy, get ready for this section, folks. Nintendo did their 1-hour reveal last Wednesday and never once mentioned price during it. People had gotten optimistic about the Switch 2 price because in February, Nintendo said this. We now know that was a complete and utter lie, as Nintendo priced the basic Switch 2 that comes with nothing at between $450 and roughly $520, depending on your region. In some places, it's even more than that. Yeah, Nintendo, way to go! You really showed people you understand the current state of the world and appreciate the harsh economic realities of the typical working family. But there's one caveat here that makes things dramatically worse. Nintendo is releasing a Japanese language only version of the Switch 2 in Japan that is region locked for the equivalent of $330. Great, so not only are you screwing over most of the world, but you're also doing something that's borderline racist. Nintendo execs, when asked about this edition, said it was priced this way to combat scalping. And if you believe that, well, let me ask you, can I interest you in buying the Brooklyn Bridge? I'll sell it cheap. So what are the excuses here? Well, one Nintendo exec says that the Switch 2 price needs to be more than the Switch 1 price, because if the Switch 1 is worth $300, then the more powerful Switch 2 is worth more than that. What a cynical, misleading, junky thing to say. Also, Bill Trinen of Nintendo blamed the price of the Switch 2 on inflation, which sounds reasonable but is really also ridiculous. And which one is it, guys? Is it so expensive because of value, or is it inflation, or is it both? The answer is, of course, neither. Both arguments made by separate people are immediately invalidated by the price of the Japanese exclusive version of the system. And no, it's not the tariffs either, and there's been a lot of talk of tariffs online. Nintendo of America president Doug Bowser said specifically in a recent interview with CNBC that the tariffs are not responsible for this. Let me show you.
As we priced the Switch 2, the price we announced today of $449 for the single SKU, we didn't consider tariffs into that equation. We felt that that was going to be the right price point for our consumers and the right value proposition, if you will, for the device that we're creating.
Now also keep in mind, if it was the tariffs, then the system should only cost more inside of the United States and not anywhere else. Also, I've rewritten this part of the video 4 times this week because of the constantly changing tariff situation. And I'm going to say this right now. Tariffs might affect the price of the system in some way, but every few days the tariff situation changes, so it's impossible to know right now. So let's talk about the price situation with games, which is also not great. Games will be priced on an individual basis, which sounds positive on its face. Some games are going to be as low as $40 brand new, some as high as $80 so far. The Joy-Cons for the original Switch were incredibly overpriced at $80. The Joy-Cons for the Switch 2 are even more insanely overpriced at a shameful $90. The Pro Controller for the original Switch was a little overpriced at $70, and the new Pro Controller for the Switch 2 is even more overpriced at $80. And frankly, these prices are disgraceful. Just disgraceful. So how is the pricing on the Switch 2 compared to other Nintendo systems historically? Let's take a brief look at every Nintendo system's launch price, along with that price adjusted for inflation, which tells us some of, but not the entire story, and I'll explain what I mean here. So at first, if you just look at this chart, you might think that the Switch 2 doesn't look so terrible here, since it comes out to be cheaper than the NES or SNES in 2025 money. But if you think that, well, you're wrong! Because you have to consider the technology in the device you're buying and what it's worth at the time you're buying it, and also that game console prices used to actually go down over time. When the NES came out, it and the Sega Master System were the most powerful home consoles you could buy. Same for the Genesis in 1989 and the SNES in 1991. Same for basically all new systems until the original Wii came out. The Wii was much less powerful than the PS3 and Xbox 360, but also cost a lot less. The Wii was $250. The PS3 came out with 2 models at $500 and $600 respectively. The Xbox 360 launched with 2 models at $300 and $400 each. The Wii was priced according to the technology inside it at the time, and Nintendo could have sold it for even less because it was just a slightly buffed GameCube packaged with the motion controller. For the Switch 2, as a home platform, it's significantly less powerful than the PS5 and Xbox Series X, and generally less powerful than even the Xbox Series S, with perhaps a few exceptions. Now, a standard PS5 goes for either $400 or $500 right now. A Series X goes anywhere from $430 to $500. An Xbox Series S is $300. In this day and age, that $450 price for the Switch 2 just seems especially egregious. But the Switch 2 is portable and has a screen, you exclaim. Well, okay, let's take a look at some portable devices with powerful SoCs. Here's the AYN Odin 2. It came out at the end of 2023. It launched at $300 for the lowest spec model with 8 gigs of RAM. It uses a Snapdragon 8 Generation 2 processor. AYN isn't nearly as big as Nintendo and needs to make a profit on the hardware it sells. There's also an updated version of the Odin 2, the Odin 2 Portal, that sells for $350 with an OLED screen that features 120Hz refresh rate. Now, the Odin 2 may come in at a little under the power level of the Switch 2 in performance, but it'll probably be pretty close. It'll be real interesting to see apples-to-apples comparisons after the Switch 2 is out. The point here is, the entry-level price for this smaller manufacturer who must make a profit on hardware is $300 for the Odin 2 and $350 for the Odin 2 Portal. And it's estimated that the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 alone costs $160. And I will also note, because I'm not hiding anything, that AYN also sells higher spec models with more internal storage and more RAM for more money, topping out at about $500 for the Odin 2 series. But the $500 model also gives you 16GB of RAM and 1TB of storage space internally. Oh, I will also note that the battery life of these devices is pretty much all day. You'll get like a minimum of 10 hours and a maximum of about 24. Now, if you look at the links below, you'll see one from GameSpot that estimates the cost of what it takes to manufacture a Switch 2, which some people are saying is $400. And they expect that Nintendo will take a loss on these after tariffs are applied. I'm not going to talk about tariffs again because, like I said, constantly changing. Now, it also says in the GameSpot article, which is quoting another article, that Nintendo is paying $150 for the NVIDIA chip that's inside the Switch 2. While that chipset price is kind of in line with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 I mentioned for the AYN Odin 2 line, I personally find that a tad unlikely. Why? Well, Nintendo is going to be producing the Switch 2 in very high volumes for years, and traditionally at least, this has meant lower prices for the chipsets over time based on meeting volume requirements for extra discounts. So I won't say it's impossible. Maybe someday we'll know more, but here's a safe bet. Nintendo is not selling the Switch 2 to Japanese consumers at a $70 loss per console. I'd go a step further and say that, based on Nintendo's history, $330 is probably roughly cost. Now I'm going to take this moment to tell you that I feel the original Switch, released in 2017, was also overpriced at the time that it came out. Based on a teardown that did the rounds of the entire internet, it seems, it was claimed that the original Switch cost $257 to manufacture when it was new in 2017. But from everything I've read about that teardown and that process and the pictures I looked at on it, they failed to take several things into consideration that could have really identified the true cost of the system. They couldn't even identify all the chips, so obviously, they didn't know exactly what they cost, they could only estimate them. They didn't even know what some of the chips did. Now, the NVIDIA Shield TV came out 2 years before the Switch in 2015. It included the system, which is almost identical to a Switch hardware-wise, by the way, a controller that used a unique method of connection for the system, Wi-Fi, an AC adapter, and an HDMI cable. It sold for $200. A Pro version with a 500GB hard drive sold for $300. And you might say, but the NVIDIA Shield TV didn't have a screen or Joy-Cons. Yeah, well, screens and digitizers don't cost $100, not even back then, especially not for mass-manufactured devices like the Switch. We might have been looking at $20 a unit or less at the time for the original Switch for the screen and digitizer. You can buy individual sets of screens, digitizers, and tools to install them for about $30 these days. As for the Joy-Con argument, the Shield TV did include a full controller using a non-standard technology, so that one is basically moot. There was definitely not $100 worth of technological differences between the Shield TV and the Switch in 2017. Let's take a look at Nintendo's profits for the last 11 years or so. They ain't exactly hurting for money, and this really exposes their lines about inflation and value I mentioned earlier as complete and utter nonsense. Nintendo could literally give Switch 2s away for free and still make money on all the games they're selling. Now, I'm not suggesting that they do that or should do that. They're a business, and for businesses to stay in business and keep making the stuff we like, they need to make money on it. But they don't need to lie to us saying they have to raise prices because of inflation. They don't have to shove the line down our throats that the Switch 2 has to cost more than a Switch 1 so people will know it's better. Seriously, that's just kind of evil. The Switch 1 probably should cost no more than like $150 these days anyway. But anyway, all this money you see up on the screen right now, I must stress, is profit. It's not revenue, it's profit. You know, the money Nintendo made in each of those years after things like operating costs, logistics, development, and support costs were considered. Yet they still have the audacity, the utter nerve, to tell people around the world that they need to charge you $450 for a Switch 2 unless you live in Japan where it's $330 to combat scalping. Give me a break. And on top of that, Doug Bowser, president of Nintendo of America and former EA executive by the way, said that if people can't afford a Switch 2, they have access to other Switch platforms. How Don-metric-y of you. Now, there have been times historically when the gaming public rightly took executives and the stupid decisions they made, or stupid things they said, to task. Gamers called out Don Matrick and Microsoft over the epically terrible Xbox One reveal.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Gamers called out Sony over the $600 price of the original PlayStation 3 at its reveal. And sure, some people like me are calling Nintendo out over the Switch 2 pricing they've revealed just last week. But you know what I didn't see a lot of during the Xbox One and PS3 debacles? People enabling the terrible decisions of Microsoft and Sony. You know what I do see right now? Lots of die-hard Nintendo fans that are 100% in Nintendo's corner and defending every last action they've taken. And that is the reason the Switch 2 price will almost certainly stay exactly where it is. Is there anything we can do about it? Well, give me just 1 or 2 more minutes of your time and we'll get to that. If you're a Nintendo fan watching this and getting angry at me, let me tell you that I absolutely do not put the blame on Nintendo alone for recent pricing trends in gaming. No, all of the current hardware manufacturers are at fault here. Sony was just as bad with the pricing of the PS5 Pro, which is a ridiculous $700 and doesn't even include a Blu-ray drive. Nope, that's $80 extra. Ridiculous. Microsoft has had plenty of pricing snafus also, as I mentioned just a moment ago. And I also blame Apple for drastically overcharging for devices and getting people used to doing something crazy like paying over $1,000 for a phone. I'd go so far as to say that the greed present in gaming today is the biggest problem in the entire industry. Let's take a super quick stroll down memory lane, shall we? In the latter days of the NES, I would see it on store shelves for $50, which is just a few years after it came out. The Genesis and SNES were roughly $100 or less within 2 years of their launch prices of $190 and $200 respectively. In fact, the Super Nintendo was dropped to $100 just roughly 1 year after it launched. And let's talk about the monster hit that was the original Sony PlayStation. It launched in 1995 at $300, but after 2 years, it sold for $150. It was down to $100 in 1999. A year after the PS2 launch, they dropped the PS1 to a measly $50. Nintendo launched the N64 at $200 in 1996 and was selling it for $130 2 years later and $100 the year after that. What is going on in modern gaming? Why don't system prices permanently drop anymore? The Switch launched at $300 in 2017. That's 8 years ago. It's the same price today that it was back then. If you want a PS5 today, well, it costs the same as it did when it launched 5 years ago. Thinking about buying new stock of last-gen systems? Well, good luck. Some of those have actually gone up in price because of scarcity. So why is it like this? Well, a big reason is because we have conditioned these companies. We have told them, even if you charge some exorbitant amount of money for something that used to have a reasonable price, we will still pay it. And hey, I'm part of the problem. I bought a Switch grudgingly at the $300 price point. I waited for a while to see if there would be a price drop, and as we know, it never happened. We're all part of the problem. How do we get here? Well, that's a topic for another video. Let's just say that FOMO is very real, social media and constant information overload have both played significant roles in bringing society to where it is right now. But I digress. I'll summarize things this way. Nintendo has decided to raise prices on hardware and software because they're sure that we're all willing to pay more for their products. There is no underlying economic reason. They are not hurting for money. Their profits are insanely high already. They're doing this because they want more of your money, plain and simple. Remember, again, they're selling the same Switch 2 system in Japan for $330 that goes for $450 to about $520 in most other regions. All they did was region lock it and remove the other languages from it. Is there any way we can stop this price creep and frankly, price leap? The only thing that can work is if we stand our ground and refuse to buy something like the Switch 2 until it is priced fairly. This kind of happened once before, and it was Nintendo that it happened to with the 3DS. The 3DS launched at $250, and it flopped hard at that price. A few months later, Nintendo cut it to $170. So what exactly would be a fair price for the Switch 2? Roughly $350 would be reasonable and show parity with the Japanese system price. Now Mario Kart World, it'll still be there in a year or two or more, folks. All we can do is scare Nintendo into doing the right thing by not giving them our money until they do. I can tell you with absolute certainty that I am not buying a Switch 2 in 2025. Almost everything they showed is coming to or already on other platforms, and in most cases runs better on them. I can wait to play Mario Kart World. I'll probably never play Donkey Kong Bonanza. I can play Metroid Prime 4 on the Switch that I already have. I like getting something new as much as everyone else, but I'm going to wait. The games will still be there, folks. If you have some willpower, we can put a stop to this. Now I know it's unlikely the scenario I just described will actually happen, but I'm trying here, and I'll make this plea to you anyway. Just don't buy a Switch 2 for now. I'm not telling you not to get one. Wait until Nintendo takes action on pricing. Forget FOMO. You don't have to play any game right now. If you don't want it spoiled, stay away from the channels and websites that you know will do that for a few days, maybe even weeks after the game you want launches. If enough people decide to wait, Nintendo will have no choice but to rethink its exploitative pricing. On the other hand, if we just blindly accept the price as it is now, not only will the current overpricing stand, the whole situation will get worse in the future. Companies like Nintendo and Sony will continue to raise prices until they find some point where people will finally say no, assuming that such a point even exists. And I'm going to leave it there. I've said enough about the Switch 2, I think. It's your turn, folks. Tell me what you think about the system. What do you think about the Switch 2, its power level, its pricing, its game pricing, the whole game key situation, and all of the related stuff? I'd love to hear about it. And also, you know what? No normal closing this week. I've said enough already. Thanks for watching, and see me later.